An Introduction to Frederick Douglass's Narrative. Background on American slavery. The slave trade began in the U.S. in 1670, and it was declared illegal in 1804. It caused extreme slaughter and the decimation of much of Africa. When shipped to America, tribes were broken up. The Middle Passage was the trade route through which these slaves were taken. Often half of these slaves would die on the trip itself. Between 1670 and 1804, at least 14 million slaves were brought to the United States. Slaves did not generally bring African culture with them because tribes were broken up before they were shipped. Some of this African culture was reconstructed in an underground manner by slaves or their ancestors, but really not much of this was done until the last 50 years. The average lifespan of a Southern slave was short. It generally ended after 7 years of field labor. Most of the plantations, particularly in the South, were small and infertile within 20 years due to aggressive profit-seeking. This resulted in using improper agricultural techniques. How did slave owners make slavery persist? In many places, particularly in parts of the South, slaves outnumbered those who supported slavery. Even guns and violence alone would not have effectively prevented rebellion by the slaves. Therefore, the slave culture worked to create an atmosphere of fear. Some of this can be seen in Douglass's narratives, where slaves learn they should not trust anyone or tell the truth to anyone. In addition, there are other examples of inhumane punishments and the creation of rumors that create this atmosphere of fear. In addition, these methods were employed to cultivate the debilitating mental condition of slavery. First, slave owners sought to break family ties. So families were often broken up and shipped into different plantations. Secondly, there was an attempt to create a sense of identity that is tied to the slave owners. Thus, slaves were often named after the slave owner themselves, creating an odd sense of loyalty. Third, there's an attempt to create communal pressure to reinforce slavery. Those who did anything perceived as anti-slavery could be in serious trouble, risking death in the South. Fourthly, hunger was a common method of creating this debilitating mental condition of slavery. Hunger resulted in these slaves feeling dependent upon the slave owners for their very lives. Fifth, making slaves afraid of or resent their moments of liberty. You'll see examples of this within Douglass's narrative. And lastly, not allowing education or reading. This is also addressed within Douglass's narrative. When slaves were first brought to the Americas, two major changes occurred. First, they were separated from other slaves who spoke the same language or who came from the same tribes in West Africa. This was meant to force them to communicate only in English and therefore discourage organized resistance. Secondly, slaves were quickly forced to convert to Christianity. Of course, slave owners required this not as a means of saving souls, but rather because Christianity could be used as a tool to ensure subservience and submission by slaves. How was Christianity used to justify and reinforce slavery? Slaves were taught that the curse of Ham in the Bible was justification for the African race being labeled as inferior. Examples of slavery in the Bible were pointed to as evidence that God must have found it permissible. Slaves were also taught to model the example of the Jews in slavery in Egypt. Wait for God to deliver them. Don't try to rebel through planning or resistance. Jesus' humility and submission was constantly discussed in order to teach slaves to turn the other cheek, rather than rebel against unjust treatment. The focus in Christianity is often on reward in the next life, in other words, heaven, for enduring injustice in this life. That, of course, encourages submission and passivity. Clearly, Christianity among slaveholders was a very corrupted form of the religion. It's worth considering how might this corrupted form of religion influence American forms of Christianity even after the end of slavery. Douglas says that the Christianity of the South is the boldest of all frauds. This is an extremely radical statement for him to make, but he felt that it was necessary because the version of Christianity in the South was deeply intertied with the culture of slavery. It is often noted in many slave narratives that those who were the most vicious were those who were also the most publicly religious. Of course, there was also a potentially dangerous role of religion that could undermine slavery among slaves and abolitionists, because Christianity in its purest sense can be viewed as a religion that encourages moral conduct, which clearly rejects doing an injustice to others, such as enslave them. What did Douglas believe would help end slavery? He believed there was a great necessity for resistance to slavery. One could not solely depend on outside help, but also should build the will to resist oneself. This required education about one's condition in slavery. Note how in the North he sees the free blacks working to protect fugitive slaves. Note how surprised he is at the relative wealth among Northerners, even such that former slaves could achieve some sense of comfort. Thus he felt that these former slaves had a sacred duty to do all they could to help end slavery. Trauma theory holds that for something to be truly overcome, traumatic events need to be relived, often through a retelling. This helps explain why Douglas wrote this narrative and why he felt a sense of freedom in finally telling his story among a group of white abolitionists.